So chapter 20 is kind of a continuation of a theme that we've talked about before, which is about energy. And so we've talked about thermodynamics, and in chapter 13 we kind of introduced the concept of entropy when we talked about solution mixing and so forth, and we revisit entropy and we think about something called Gibbs free energy in this chapter. So again, the 5 skills in this chapter begin just with a review of some of the previous skills that we've talked about. So again, thinking about kinetics, but understanding how it's different from thermodynamics. And then again, reviewing what we've already talked about in terms of energy, and remembering that chemistry happens so that things go downhill in energy. And this is a theme that we continue to see throughout our course here. We spent a good bit of time talking about entropy. And even though we introduced entropy in chapter 13 and learned that it's S, we learned about concepts of entropy that we think about in terms of disorder and more molecules moving more, we start thinking about entropy quantitatively, and we continue to use Appendix B, right? So Appendix B we first talked about in Gen Chem 1 when we talked about Hess's law and used enthalpy values from here. So we continue with entropy values and learn how to use Appendix B as a way to predict or to calculate entropy for a process by kind of looking at the entropy of products and subtracting the entropy of reactants. And so that's kind of our second skill that we have. Our third skill is really learning about something new, which is Gibbs free energy, and finally allowing us to see the consideration of both enthalpy and entropy. And even though we sort of talked about these loosely in chapter 13 when we talked about entropy enthalpy compensation, so again, remembering enthalpy is really the idea of thinking about intermolecular forces, of thinking about heat and bonds, and thinking about how entropy is, again, disorder and more molecules moving more, but really thinking about whether a process is spontaneous takes both of those into consideration. And we talked about that in chapter 13 when we talked about solution formation and how you could have an endothermic process, so a salt that dissolves but the solution gets cold, and so how could that be a spontaneous process? So we've actually already talked about a good bit of this, but now we finally have an equation to put it all together with delta G equals delta H minus T delta S. And so we did a lot in this chapter with both qualitative aspects of thermodynamics and predicting things based on what we see from a chemical reaction or kind of the state of a system, but also then using Appendix B now with free energy to be able to sort of calculate that. And the last part of this chapter is really kind of thinking about equating delta G and Q. And so again, this concept that where we're at, maybe with our Q, might not be where we want to be, which is our K. And we always have kind of this shift of an equilibrium to allow us to get to where we want to be. So a lot of things that maybe pull things together from previous chapters, but a good bit of this chapter is really just learning how to use Appendix B and thinking about the contributions of entropy and enthalpy to a spontaneous process.